Hi, my name is Alex King. I'm a director at Amplio Services here. I've been a price to win analyst for 9 years, and I'm making these videos to explain some of the common questions that I get asked about price to win. One of them is price to win a new thing? And the reasons that people are normally asking me this question is because either their company doesn't really do it, or their company doesn't have an established process for it, or they just haven't heard of it at all. But the answer to that question is no, it's not new at all. There are people in America that have been doing it for 30 or 40 years, and there are some really good books to come out on the subject, but again, all from America. I'll give you some examples of them. These are just my personal recommendations. Winning the Big Ones by Michael O'Gwyn and Kim Kelly. So these are the guys that actually did the price to win for the F-35. It's actually a book all about business capture as opposed to specifically price to win, but it has a whole chapter on the subject, and it's full of some really good real-life examples that I really recommend. If you do want a book that's more detailed in terms of going on to overall price to win, then Hope is Not a Winning Strategy, but Price to Win Is by Tony Constable. That book's all dedicated to price to win, so there's really as much in there as you like. But also, for those of you more process-minded, then the Shipley Capture Guide also has a whole section on price to win there, and certainly everything that's in there is what we teach on our price to win training courses. Really, that brings us to the question of why price to win hasn't got so much traction in Europe so that people think it's new. I have a couple of suggestions on that front. The GDP of the European Union is broadly similar to the GDP of America, but of course the European Union is split up of 27 or 28 different governments, depending on whether Brexit has happened when you're watching this video. So each of those governments is different in the way it buys things, in the sort of culture that it has, and its certain preferences. And so to do price to win properly, you need to understand these. So that's obviously a lot more work for actually the same amount of opportunities overall. That's one problem with it in terms of doing that analysis. The other problem is data, and that's something we're going to come to now. So I'm going to put on the screen some examples of where you can get some really detailed, really good information about the American government's budget, but also things that they've bought in the past and those prices. And those prices prove to be really useful in terms of making trends and doing what we call comparative analysis, which is discussed in more detail on another video. You just don't get that in the European Union, which makes things much more difficult. But fortunately, there are other ways that we can get that information, particularly using parametric estimating, but there's also some information that we do have access to. So in America, private company information is private, as the name would suggest, whereas actually in the UK and other countries in Europe, you can go to something called Companies House, which is where the companies actually release all their financial information, but for private companies. So why is this important? Well, in that, you'll get lots of details about how much they spent on salaries, how many employees they had for those salaries, and you can understand that those are really useful building blocks for building up labour rates. You'll also see how much overhead they had and how much turnover they had for those employees as well. So that's a really important thing, because when you're looking at the big American contractors, for example, let's take Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, all you can really see in America is their group accounts. And those are an average of an average of an average. It's very difficult to know what the realities are of a specific business unit that you're competing against is. Whereas in Europe, we actually have access to that and we can see. And what we see is when we look at the big British companies like British Telecom, BAE Systems, for example, Vodafone, that actually there are vast differences between the different units, the different subgroups of that business. And we can actually understand those. So that's a useful reference point that we have in the UK and most of the European Union, as opposed to America. So really, the process of doing price to win in America and Europe is actually very similar. It's just different in the execution of where you're actually going to find data and what you actually have to work with. That's where the real differences lie.